A cowboy repaired an Apache woman's wagon. The next morning, riders in war paint encircled his home. John Whitaker had lived on the edge of the New Mexico frontier for most of his adult life. He was a cowboy, plain and simple, and the wide open plains, rocky hills, and winding rivers were as much home to him as the small cabin he had built with his own hands. Life on the frontier was not easy. The sun could burn mercilessly during the day, and at night the cold could seep into a man's bones. Supplies were always limited, and neighbors were few and far between. But John had learned to live with the land and to read its moods, the way the wind whispered through the mesquite, how the clouds hinted at coming storms, or how the birds' movements could tell a story of approaching danger or change. One early morning, John saddled up his horse, a sturdy brown mare named Daisy, and set out on his usual rounds. He often checked on the cattle grazing along the riverbanks and inspected the fences that stretched like thin threads across the prairie. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of damp earth and sage. John had been awake before dawn, as usual, and he was alert to everything around him. Every step of Daisy's hooves seemed to echo quietly in the vast stillness of the morning. As he rode along the river crossing, he noticed something unusual. A broken wagon. It was off the main trail, tilted slightly to one side, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. The wheel on the right was cracked, and the axle looked like it had been damaged for some time. A few scattered belongings were strewn around the ground. A blanket, a small wooden chest, and a bundle of tools, though nothing that could fix a wagon properly. What caught John's attention, however, was not just the wagon itself, but the woman standing beside it. She was alone, and John could see that she was struggling to lift the heavy wheel, her face showing strain and determination. Her clothing was simple but practical, suitable for travel, and her hair was long and dark, tied back to keep it out of her face. She looked up as John approached and froze for a moment, her dark eyes cautious and wary. John knew the tensions between settlers like him and the Apache people were high, and he understood that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. So he slowed Daisy to a gentle stop, keeping his hands visible, and raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "Need a hand with that?" The woman hesitated. Her eyes darted to his hands, then to his horse, then back to him. There was no smile, no immediate reply, just a careful watchfulness. John understood. On this land, trust had to be earned, not given freely. He dismounted slowly, letting the reins fall loosely over Daisy's neck. He bent down, studying the wheel and axle, and then glanced at the woman. "Looks like the axle's cracked here," he said. "I can fix it if you like. Won't take long." She said nothing, just tilted her head slightly as if considering his offer. Her silence spoke volumes. It was both cautious and polite. John nodded to himself and set to work. He rummaged through his saddlebag for tools he always carried: wrenches, a hammer, grease, and some spare bolts he had been saving for emergencies. Daisy munched quietly on some grass nearby, unbothered by the tension in the air. John worked carefully, taking his time. He didn't want to make any sudden movements that might alarm her. As he tightened the bolts and examined the wheel, he spoke softly, not to force conversation, but to make the silence less heavy. "Name's John," he said. "I live down by the old stone cabin. Been fixing wagons and fences around here a long time." The woman shifted slightly but did not speak. He could tell she understood him, but perhaps words were not needed. Actions, he thought, were louder than anything spoken. His fingers, skilled from years of mending wagons and repairing fences, moved quickly but carefully. He replaced the cracked axle with a spare one he had brought, greased the wheel, and ensured it turned smoothly. It was hard work, but John didn't mind. He liked the satisfaction of fixing things. Every squeak, every stubborn bolt that finally gave way felt like a small victory. While he worked, he stole glances at the woman. She did not interfere but watched with keen eyes, alert and observant. John noticed the subtle way she adjusted the blanket around the wagon, keeping it clean from dust, and how her hands, though small, seemed capable and strong. There was a dignity in the way she carried herself, even in a moment of struggle, and John couldn't help but admire it. He knew this wasn't just anyone on the prairie. This was someone used to surviving, someone who understood the land as well as he did, though in a different way. After what felt like a long while but was only a few hours, the wagon was finally ready. The wheels spun freely, and the axle was secure. John leaned back, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and stepped aside. He looked at the woman, who finally allowed herself a small nod of acknowledgement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but John recognized it as gratitude. "You're good at what you do," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." John nodded. "Just doing what anyone would, I reckon. Name's John, as I said." "You're welcome." She gathered her belongings and started to place them back on the wagon, her movements precise and careful. John watched, noticing how she handled each item with care, as though each had a story of its own. There was a certain rhythm to her actions, a silent grace in the way she worked. It reminded him that life on the frontier wasn't just about brute strength or endurance. It was about patience, skill, and respect for the land and for each other. By the time she was ready to move again, the sun was fully risen, casting warm golden light across the river and the plains beyond. The air smelled fresh, carrying hints of wildflowers and earth. John stepped back and gestured toward the trail. "Careful out there," he said. "The ground can be tricky around the crossing. Keep your wagon steady." She mounted her wagon without a word, but her eyes met his for a moment. It was not a glance of fear or suspicion, but one of acknowledgement, a silent understanding between two people who had shared a brief, unspoken connection. Then, without any further words, she guided her wagon back onto the trail and disappeared into the distance, dust rising behind her as she moved. John stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle and the horizon stretch endlessly. He felt a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Relief that the wagon was repaired and that everything had gone smoothly, and curiosity about the woman who had just vanished as suddenly as she appeared. He had no idea who she was or where she was going, but he knew he would remember her. There was something about her presence, quiet and strong, that lingered in his mind. As he mounted Daisy and continued along his rounds, John thought about the land, the people, and the fragile balance of life on the frontier. Every day brought challenges: storms, broken fences, wandering cattle, and the ever-present tension between settlers and the native people. But it also brought moments like this, small flashes of connection and humanity, reminders that the world was larger than any one person's struggles. He knew that such moments were rare, and that sometimes a simple act of kindness could echo further than anyone could imagine. By the time John returned to his cabin that afternoon, he was tired, but his spirit was lighter. He tended to the animals, mended a few fences, and prepared a simple meal. Yet, all the while, his mind kept drifting back to the woman, and the broken wagon, and the quiet morning when two strangers met by chance and shared a moment of trust. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would have consequences he could never have foreseen. It was the kind of morning that set the stage for a story he would carry for the rest of his life, a story about courage, kindness, and the unexpected ways people could touch each other's lives in the vast open frontier. The next morning, John Whitaker woke to a silence he had never experienced before. It was the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Normally, at sunrise, the prairie came alive with the sounds of birds chirping, the lowing of cattle, and the rustle of wind through the sagebrush. But today, there was nothing. No birds, no wind, no sound at all, except the faint crunch of frost under his boots as he stepped outside. John frowned. Something was different. He had lived on this land for years and knew its moods, its subtle warnings. The stillness didn't feel natural. He scanned the horizon, the rolling plains stretching as far as his eyes could see, and noticed shadows moving along the ridgeline. At first he thought it might be a herd of deer or some wild horses, but the shapes were too deliberate, too coordinated. His heart began to beat faster, not with fear exactly, but with alertness. As he approached the edge of the clearing near his cabin, he saw them clearly. A group of riders, painted in traditional colors, sat silently on their horses. Their faces were covered with patterns of white, red, and black, and feathers adorned their hair. They were positioned in a wide circle around his cabin, keeping a careful distance. John's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he paused, remembering the lessons of the frontier. Quick action could cause misunderstanding, and misunderstanding could escalate into trouble. He took a deep breath and stepped slowly back toward his porch, keeping his hands visible. The woman whose wagon he had repaired yesterday came to mind immediately. Could this be connected to her? He had not expected that a small act of kindness could draw attention, and certainly not like this. Yet, there they were, silent, still, watching. John's mind raced. He thought about the neighbors, but he was alone for miles. There was no one to call for help, no one to warn. The responsibility for the situation rested entirely on his shoulders. John did what he had always done in uncertain situations. He waited and observed. He studied the riders carefully, noticing small details, the way they sat in their saddles, the careful handling of their horses, and the way their eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of his cabin and surroundings. He realized they were not careless or chaotic. They were disciplined and purposeful. There was a quiet strength in the way they held themselves, a sense that they belonged to this land as much as he did, though in very different ways. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes passed slowly, and John felt the tension building. Daisy, his horse, shifted nervously, sensing the unusual atmosphere. He stroked her neck gently to calm her. He knew he needed to stay calm himself, to think clearly and not make any sudden moves that could be misunderstood. In moments like this, the frontier taught him that patience was often the best tool a man could have. Eventually, one rider separated slightly from the others and raised a hand. It was a signal, though John could not tell its exact meaning. He hesitated, but chose to respond with a gesture of his own, raising his hand and stepping slightly forward to show that he meant no harm. Slowly, carefully, he spoke, his voice calm and even. "Good morning," he said. "I mean no trouble." There was no immediate response, only the faint whisper of the wind and the careful shifting of horses. John's mind raced again, trying to consider all possibilities. Perhaps they were here to ask for help, or maybe they were investigating something. He reminded himself to stay observant, to watch their movements closely. One thing was certain: they were aware of him, aware of the cabin, and aware of every action he took. Minutes later, the woman he had helped appeared at the edge of the circle, walking toward the center with careful steps. She looked at John, and this time he saw a small, almost imperceptible smile on her face. It was not a smile of amusement, but of recognition, a sign that she had remembered him and the kindness he had shown. The other riders stayed in place, forming a quiet, respectful barrier around her as she approached. John felt a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Relief that they were not rushing forward aggressively, and curiosity about what they intended. He realized that this moment could go many ways, but the way they were conducting themselves suggested that they were here to communicate, not to fight. He took another careful step forward, keeping his hands raised slightly and his body relaxed. The woman raised her hands in a gentle gesture, indicating that John should remain calm. She then made a series of movements, pointing to the wagon she had been traveling with, and then to John himself. Slowly, John understood. They had come because of the kindness he had shown yesterday. His small act of helping had been noticed and respected. The tension in the circle did not fully dissipate, but it shifted from suspicion to cautious acknowledgement. John lowered his hand slightly and nodded. "I see," he said softly. "I only did what I thought was right." The woman nodded back, and the riders murmured quietly among themselves. John noticed the way they exchanged glances, not with hostility, but with consideration. They were communicating, silently and carefully, respecting boundaries and each other's space. John realized that this was a kind of understanding he had rarely experienced, an unspoken agreement between strangers that small acts could carry deep meaning. The morning sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the prairie. John felt the warmth on his face, but also felt the weight of the moment. He knew that every movement mattered. Every gesture could be interpreted in multiple ways. He kept his posture relaxed, but alert, ready to respond if needed. At the same time, he wanted to honor the trust that had brought these people to him. The woman approached closer, and John noticed the careful way she moved, the quiet confidence in her steps. She spoke a few words, though he could not understand them fully. Instead, he focused on her gestures and expressions, trying to understand the meaning behind them. Slowly, it became clear. They were not here to harm him. They were here to acknowledge him, to recognize his courage, and perhaps to build a fragile bridge of trust. John felt a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and a deep respect for the people who had surrounded him. He realized that the frontier was not just about survival or hard work. It was about understanding, patience, and the connections that could form even between people from very different worlds. In a place where misunderstandings could lead to disaster, moments like this were rare and precious. As the morning progressed, John offered water from a small bucket he kept outside for Daisy. The woman accepted, and he noticed the way she drank carefully, appreciating the gesture. The other riders remained in their positions, observing quietly. John understood that they were testing him, gauging his intentions, and deciding whether he could be trusted. He resolved to remain calm, honest, and open. Hours passed slowly, and yet the moment did not feel rushed. John spoke softly, sharing simple words about the land, the cattle, and his work. The woman listened intently, nodding occasionally, and the riders watched with steady attention. Though there were no grand words exchanged, a dialogue was taking place, a dialogue of trust, respect, and understanding. By late morning, John felt the tension ease slightly. The circle of riders had not moved closer, but their presence no longer felt threatening. Instead, it carried a sense of respect, a silent acknowledgement that his actions yesterday had mattered more than he could have imagined. He realized that this was a turning point, a moment where two worlds had met and communicated without words, through observation, gestures, and shared recognition. Finally, the woman made a small gesture toward the riders, signaling that it was time to leave. The riders began to move slowly, maintaining their circle until they reached a safe distance. John watched carefully, understanding that this was not a hasty departure, but a deliberate and respectful retreat. He felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had met their test with honesty and calmness. As they disappeared over the ridgeline, John remained standing on the porch, Daisy at his side. The prairie returned to its normal sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustle of wind, and the distant calls of cattle. But John's mind was far from calm. He replayed every moment, every gesture, every glance, trying to understand the depth of what had just occurred. It was a moment he knew he would remember for the rest of his life, a lesson in patience, respect, and the power of kindness. He returned to his cabin feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. He tended to Daisy and the small chores that awaited him, but his thoughts kept returning to the morning. He knew that life on the frontier would continue to be full of challenges, but he also knew that a single act of honesty and courage could create ripples far beyond what he could see. He had survived the test of patience and trust, and in doing so had learned that true respect often came quietly, without words, and sometimes from the most unexpected places. John Whitaker spent the rest of the day trying to return to a sense of normalcy, but he found it impossible. The encounter with the riders that morning had left him with a mix of curiosity and caution. He could not stop thinking about the woman whose wagon he had repaired, and the silent, careful way the riders had approached his cabin. There was something about the experience that stayed with him, a quiet respect that he had rarely seen in the years he had lived on the frontier. By late afternoon, John decided he needed to prepare. He knew that people on this land, especially those who had traveled long distances and carried responsibilities for their families or tribes, paid attention to small details. Every movement, every sound, every gesture could matter. He checked his cabin, ensuring that the doors were secure and that his few belongings were in order. He stacked firewood neatly by the porch, filled the water bucket for Daisy, and swept the small path leading to the cabin. It was not just about preparation. It was about showing respect, whether the visitors returned or not. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and deep purple, John heard the faint sound of hooves. His heart leaped, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped onto the porch and squinted toward the ridgeline. There, in the dimming light, he saw the same group of riders approaching, moving quietly, but with purpose. At the front was the woman whose wagon he had repaired. She rode slowly, her posture steady and confident, as if she had all the time in the world. John lowered himself gently from the porch and raised a hand in greeting. Daisy shifted her weight, sensing the unusual tension in the air. John spoke softly. "Good evening," he said. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time she spoke a few words he could understand. "We came to talk," she said, her voice calm and even. The other riders stopped at a distance, forming a wide, respectful circle around the cabin. Their faces were still painted with traditional colors, but there was no hint of aggression. Instead, they watched carefully, observing the interaction with a quiet patience. John nodded. "I'm listening," he replied. He wanted to make it clear that he meant no harm, that he was open to communication. He could see the careful way the woman studied him, noting his stance, his gestures, and the way he held himself. Every detail mattered to both of them. The woman gestured toward the cabin and then back to the riders, indicating that she wanted him to approach. John stepped off the porch slowly, hands visible, and walked a few paces toward her. She smiled slightly, not with amusement, but with acknowledgement, and John realized that trust was beginning to form, however fragile it might be. She began to speak in broken English, and John did his best to understand. Her words were simple, but the meaning was clear. Yesterday you helped. Wagon broken.
You.
Good man. John felt a warmth in his chest at her words. He nodded, humbled by the recognition. I only did what anyone would, he said quietly. I didn't expect anything in return. She shook her head slightly, as if to say that it was more than just fixing a wagon. Actions matter, she said. People add. Sometimes remember. Her words were slow but deliberate, emphasizing their importance. John understood. It was not just about the wagon. It was about integrity, about the courage to do the right thing even when no one is watching. The other riders shifted slightly, and John noticed that they seemed to be communicating silently with each other. Their gestures were subtle, almost imperceptible, but John could see that there was a hierarchy among them, and the woman was clearly respected. She turned her attention back to him. We want
No more.
she said. Who? You? Name's John Whitaker, he said. I live here, by this cabin. I work the land, look after cattle, and keep the fences in order. Not much else to tell. The woman nodded, and he could see that she appreciated his honesty. Land yours, she said, pointing toward the fields and the cabin. Respect, land important. John agreed. Yes, the land is everything here. You treat it well. It gives you life.
You neglect it. You suffer.
She looked at him carefully, studying his face. Then, without speaking, she gestured toward Daisy and the small garden he had planted behind the cabin. John understood. She was learning about him, his life, his routines, and his care for the things around him. It was a quiet form of communication, built on observation and mutual respect. Hours passed as they continued to exchange simple words, gestures, and glances. John learned a little about her people, about their travels, their responsibilities, and the ways they survived on this challenging land. He realized that, while their language was different, the values they shared were strikingly similar. Respect, honesty, and courage mattered to both of them. At one point, the woman gestured toward the horizon, pointing to the distant hills. John understood that she was speaking of journeys, of the long distances they had traveled to arrive here. He nodded, thinking about the countless miles he had ridden with cattle, the fences he had repaired, and the solitude he had grown used to. Life on the frontier was full of challenges, but it was also full of moments of connection like this, moments that reminded him that human kindness could cross any boundary. John realized that these interactions were more than just polite conversation. They were building a bridge of understanding, one small step at a time. He found himself speaking more freely, sharing stories of his life, his work, and the little victories that came with living off the land. He told them about the animals he cared for, the fences he repaired, and the storms he had weathered. The woman listened intently, occasionally gesturing to the riders to indicate that they were paying attention. In turn, they shared stories as best they could. Words were few, but the meaning was clear. They spoke of survival, of family, and of the importance of community. John realized that, even though their worlds were different, the challenges and values they shared were strikingly similar. It was a lesson in empathy, in seeing the humanity in others, and in recognizing that kindness could create bonds stronger than any language barrier. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the prairie was bathed in silver moonlight. John invited the woman and her group to stay near the fire he had built, not for comfort, but as a gesture of goodwill. They accepted, sitting in a respectful circle around the flames. The fire crackled softly, and the smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the scents of pine and dry grass. John felt a sense of calm and connection that he had rarely experienced. They spent hours in quiet conversation, sharing small gifts of food, water, and stories. John offered dried meat and bread, while they shared small bundles of herbs and grains they had carried. Every exchange was measured, respectful, and meaningful. The silence between words was as important as the words themselves, filled with understanding and mutual respect. John realized that these hours were more than just a meeting. They were a lesson in patience, observation, and communication. In a world where misunderstandings could have serious consequences, they had found a way to speak without words, to build trust through actions and attention. He felt a growing respect for the woman in her group, and he knew that this experience would stay with him forever. By the time the moon was high in the sky, the conversation slowed. The woman and her group began to prepare to leave, signaling that their visit had come to an end. John felt a sense of loss, knowing that this unique moment of connection was ending, but he also felt gratitude. He had learned something rare and precious, how small acts of kindness and honesty could ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined. Before they left, the woman approached him once more. "Morrow." She placed a small hand on his arm in a silent gesture of acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, but John understood perfectly. It was a gesture of respect, gratitude, and connection. The riders mounted their horses, and slowly, deliberately, they moved away from the cabin, maintaining a wide circle until they disappeared over the distant hills. John stood on the porch, watching the last of them vanish into the night. The prairie returned to its normal sounds, the rustle of the wind, the distant calls of animals, and the soft whisper of the stars above. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that trust had been built and a rare moment of understanding had occurred. As he returned to the cabin, he tended to Daisy and the small chores that awaited him, but his mind kept returning to the events of the day. He realized that life on the frontier was not just about survival, hard work, or solitude. It was also about connection, empathy, and the quiet power of doing what is right, even when no one is watching. He understood, more clearly than ever, that trust and respect could cross boundaries, languages, and cultures, creating bonds that were as enduring as the land itself. That night, John lay in his small cabin, the quiet of the prairie surrounding him, and thought about the woman, the riders, and the lessons he had learned. He knew that the encounter would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that courage and kindness were always noticed, even in a world as vast and challenging as the frontier. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had acted with integrity and that sometimes the smallest actions could create the greatest connections. The next morning, John Whitaker awoke to the sound of birds slowly returning to the prairie, their song soft and tentative after the quiet of the past days. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky with gentle shades of pink and gold. There was a sense of calm, but John knew better than to let his guard down completely. The encounter with the riders had left a lasting impression, and he understood that trust, once earned, could be delicate and easily broken. John began his day as he usually did, feeding Daisy, checking the fences, and inspecting the cattle that grazed across the rolling plains. But today his movements were more thoughtful, measured. He kept thinking about the previous day, about the woman, and the group of riders who had surrounded his cabin. Their visit had been a strange mix of tension and respect, and he realized that while the immediate danger had passed, the lessons he had learned were only beginning to unfold. By mid-morning, A faint sound of hooves reached John's ears. He turned toward the trail leading to his cabin and saw the riders approaching again. This time, they came at a slower pace, as if they intended to spend more time with him. At the front was the woman whose wagon he had repaired, her posture calm and confident. She nodded slightly as she noticed him on the porch, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement that John returned with a gentle wave. The riders dismounted carefully, forming a loose circle around the cabin. They did not appear threatening. Instead, their movements carried a sense of purpose and respect. John noticed that their faces were painted as before, but now there was a hint of curiosity and interest, not just observation. They were here to engage, to communicate further, and perhaps to teach as much as to learn. John approached them slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "Good morning," he said. "I see you've returned. Please, make yourselves comfortable." "Ah." The woman stepped forward and gestured toward the ground, indicating that they would sit nearby. John placed a few logs around the fire pit he had prepared the day before, and the group settled around it, leaving space for John to stand or sit as he preferred. There was a quiet understanding in the way they arranged themselves, an unspoken agreement that this was a meeting of respect, not confrontation. The woman spoke first, her voice measured and deliberate. "We want understand you," she said. "Learn ways live land." John nodded slowly. "I can tell you about the land," he replied. "How to care for it, how to work with it. The land gives life, but it also takes if you're not careful." She listened intently, her dark eyes bright with attention. The other riders leaned slightly forward, clearly interested in what John had to say. He realized that this was more than just conversation. It was a sharing of knowledge, a bridging of worlds. The frontier was harsh, and both he and these travelers had learned that survival depended not just on skill, but on understanding, respect, and careful observation. John began to show them some of his daily routines. He demonstrated how he repaired fences, explaining the importance of keeping the cattle contained and safe. He pointed out the best spots to find water along the river, and he described the habits of the local wildlife. The woman nodded frequently, and the other riders observed closely, occasionally making gestures to one another as if confirming their understanding. As the hours passed, John offered simple food, dried meat, bread, and water from the well. The woman accepted, and the riders shared small portions of their own provisions, including nuts, dried fruit, and herbs they had carried. Every exchange was quiet, respectful, and deliberate. John noticed the care with which they handled their supplies, the same care he took in tending to his land. It was a subtle reminder that though their lives were different, the values they held were remarkably similar. The conversation grew more personal. The woman asked about John's life, about how he came to settle on this land, and about the challenges he faced. John spoke of long days under the sun, of storms that threatened to wash away his fences, and of lonely nights when the wind howled through the prairie. He also spoke of small victories, the birth of a calf, the repair of a fence just in time, the way Daisy had learned a new path through the hills. These stories were simple, but they conveyed the rhythms of frontier life and the patience it demanded. In return, the woman and the riders shared stories of their travels. Words were few, but John could understand the meaning through gestures, expressions, and repeated emphasis. He learned that they had been traveling for many days, ensuring the safety of their community and teaching younger members the ways of the land. They had responsibilities that required courage, skill, and patience, qualities John respected deeply. John realized that this exchange of knowledge was more than practical instruction. It was a teaching of values, a demonstration of integrity, and a way of building trust through shared understanding. Each story, each careful gesture reinforced the idea that honesty, respect, and courage were universal, transcending language and culture. He felt a deep sense of connection to these people, even though their lives were vastly different from his own. As the sun climbed higher, the group moved closer to the cabin. John showed them the garden he had planted, explaining how he grew vegetables to supplement his diet. He described the careful rotation of crops and the importance of keeping the soil healthy. The woman nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by the attention he paid to even small details. She gestured toward some herbs she carried and offered them to John, who accepted them gratefully. The exchange was quiet, but it carried a profound meaning, a shared respect for the land and the life it sustained. Time passed quickly in this way. They observed each other's work, shared stories, and exchanged lessons. John felt a growing respect for the woman and the riders, recognizing the skill, patience, and dedication required for their lives. He also felt that they were beginning to trust him, that they saw him not as a stranger or a threat, but as a man of integrity who understood the value of kindness and honesty. By afternoon, the mood had shifted. The initial tension of the previous day had eased, replaced by a careful camaraderie. John noticed the way the riders moved more naturally around the cabin, how they communicated silently with each other, and how the woman occasionally smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing trust. He realized that these moments were rare, delicate, and precious, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to experience them. The woman gestured toward a distant ridge, pointing out a landmark, and then to John, indicating that she wanted to show him something. He followed her instructions, and together they walked a short distance, the riders trailing quietly behind. From the top of the ridge, John could see the rolling plains stretching far into the horizon, dotted with cattle, wildflowers, and the winding river. The woman gestured toward the land as if to say, "This is our home, this is your home. We respect it, and we honor it." John nodded, understanding her meaning. The land was more than property or territory. It was a living, breathing presence that demanded respect. The woman's gesture was a lesson in humility and acknowledgement, a reminder that the frontier was not just about survival, but about coexistence and understanding. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, John and the group returned to the cabin. They sat quietly by the fire he had built, sharing the remaining provisions and observing the changing colors of the sky. The moment was peaceful, filled with the simple rhythms of life, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a hawk, and the soft murmur of the wind through the grasses. John realized that trust was not a single act, but a series of moments, small gestures, and shared experiences. The woman and her group had come to test him, to observe his character, and to build a fragile connection. In turn, he had shown patience, honesty, and respect. Together, they had formed a bond that, though delicate, carried a powerful meaning. As night fell, the woman gestured that it was time for them to leave. John felt a pang of loss, knowing that this rare and meaningful connection was ending for the moment. But he also felt gratitude and pride. He had acted with integrity, and in doing so had earned the respect of people who had every reason to be cautious. Before departing, the woman stepped forward and placed her hand briefly on John's arm. It was a silent gesture, full of meaning, acknowledgement, respect, and a quiet promise that their paths might cross again. The riders mounted their horses carefully and moved away, leaving John alone once more with the prairie, the fire, and the quiet night. John stood on the porch, watching the last of them disappear into the darkness. The prairie returned to its familiar sounds, and he felt a deep sense of peace. He understood now that the frontier was not just about survival or solitude. It was about connection, trust, and the quiet power of kindness. The lessons of the day would stay with him forever, shaping the way he approached life, work, and the people he encountered. For John Whitaker, this was more than an encounter. It was a revelation. The fragile trust he had built with the woman and her group was a reminder that courage, honesty, and respect could bridge divides, create understanding, and leave lasting impressions. And as he tended to his cabin, fed Daisy, and prepared for the night, he knew that the bonds formed through such moments were among the most valuable treasures of all. The next morning, John Whitaker awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation. The prairie was calm, bathed in the soft light of sunrise, and the air smelled fresh with dew. After the encounters of the past days, he had grown accustomed to the idea that life on the frontier could shift in unexpected ways. He had learned to expect the unexpected, to trust his instincts, and to understand that even small actions could have effects far beyond what he imagined. John began his day by tending to Daisy, brushing her coat, feeding her oats, and checking the fences. Every movement was deliberate, careful, and reflective. He thought about the woman whose wagon he had repaired, the group of riders who had encircled his cabin, and the long hours spent exchanging stories, lessons, and gestures of respect. Those moments had changed something in him, teaching him that courage, honesty, and kindness were as valuable as skill and strength on the frontier. By late morning, a gentle sound reached him, the distant clip-clop of hooves on the trail. John's heart stirred with curiosity. He looked toward the ridge and saw the familiar figures of the riders approaching. The woman from the wagon led them, her posture calm, steady, and confident. She gave a slight nod when she saw John, a silent greeting that John returned with a wave. There was no tension this time, only a quiet understanding between them. The riders dismounted at a respectful distance, forming a loose circle around the cabin. John noticed that their faces were painted as before, but there was now a sense of ease, not just observation. Their movements were smooth and natural, as if they had grown comfortable in his presence. John felt a warmth in his chest, realizing that the fragile trust he had built with them had held firm and was now growing stronger. The woman approached John first. Her dark eyes were bright, and she spoke slowly, clearly choosing her words. "We come share time learn," she said. John understood immediately. They had traveled a long distance, not out of suspicion or curiosity alone, but to deepen the bond that had begun days earlier. It was a gesture of friendship, respect, and recognition. John smiled softly. "I am glad you have returned," he said. "There is much we can share." He gestured toward the fire pit he had prepared, inviting them to sit. The riders followed her lead, settling comfortably, but still with a quiet dignity that reminded John of the respect they carried for each other. The morning passed in a rhythm of shared work and conversation. John showed them how he tended his small garden, explaining the importance of water, sunlight, and soil care. The woman nodded thoughtfully, and the riders observed closely, occasionally exchanging gestures that John could not fully interpret but understood as communication. He realized that they were learning not just about the land, but also about the way he lived and cared for the things around him. In turn, the woman and her group shared stories from their travels. Words were few, but their meaning was clear. Through gestures, repetition, and expressions, John learned about their community, their journeys across the plains, and the lessons they taught younger members about courage, patience, and respect for the land. He realized that, despite differences in language and culture, the values they held were remarkably similar to his own. Honesty, integrity, and care for others mattered equally to both. By midday, John invited the woman and the riders to share a meal with him. He brought out bread, dried meat, and water, offering it as a gesture of friendship. The woman accepted with a gentle nod, and the riders shared small portions of their own provisions. Every exchange was careful, deliberate, and meaningful. John noticed the respect in the way they handled the food, the same care he took with his cattle and his land. It was a quiet lesson in humility, gratitude, and the simple beauty of shared moments. After the meal, John suggested a walk to a nearby ridge. The woman agreed, leading her group with steady steps. John followed, Daisy walking beside him, her ears flicking toward the riders as if sensing the importance of the moment. When they reached the top of the ridge, the view stretched endlessly before them. Rolling plains, winding rivers, and distant hills, bathed in sunlight. The woman gestured toward the horizon, pointing out features of the land and then toward John. He understood her meaning. The land was theirs, to respect, to care for, and to share understanding about. It was not just about property or survival. It was about connection, stewardship, and harmony. John felt a profound sense of peace, realizing that the small actions he had taken, repairing a broken wagon, showing respect, and acting with honesty, had created a ripple that reached far beyond his cabin. As they walked back, John continued to talk about his life on the land. He shared stories of long days repairing fences, tending cattle, and navigating storms. The woman listened intently, nodding occasionally, and the riders observed quietly. They asked questions through gestures and broken words, seeking to understand the rhythm of his life and the way he balanced work, survival, and care for the land. John realized that this exchange was more than storytelling. It was teaching, learning, and building trust through shared understanding. By late afternoon, the group returned to the cabin. John prepared the fire and they sat around it, sharing more stories and lessons. The woman and her group offered small gifts, herbs, dried grains, and simple tokens from their travels. John accepted them with gratitude, understanding that each gift carried not just utility, but respect and acknowledgement. In turn, he shared tools, food, and small items he had used to live on the land. Each gesture reinforced the growing bond between them, a bond built on patience, observation, and mutual respect. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink, orange, and purple, the woman gestured toward her riders. They understood it was time to prepare to leave, but the moment was unhurried, deliberate, and meaningful. John helped with small tasks, adjusting saddles, ensuring water and food were ready, and offering words of encouragement. It was a quiet ceremony of respect, demonstrating the care and thoughtfulness that had defined their interactions since the first encounter. Before departing, the woman approached John once more. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, gratitude, and connection. No words were needed. The meaning was clear. John felt a warmth in his chest, knowing that this moment would remain with him forever. It was a reminder that small acts of kindness and honesty could create bonds stronger than words, deeper than fear, and more lasting than distance. The riders mounted their horses carefully, forming a loose circle that allowed the woman to lead the way. Slowly, deliberately, they moved away from the cabin, maintaining a respectful distance. John watched them disappear over the distant hills, feeling both a sense of loss and a profound gratitude. The prairie returned to its familiar sounds, the rustle of grass, the distant call of birds, and the soft whisper of the wind. But the memory of their presence lingered, filling the space with meaning, trust, and connection. John returned to his cabin and tended to Daisy, who seemed calm and content after the long day. He prepared a simple meal for himself, sitting quietly by the fire and reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The encounters with the woman and her riders had taught him lessons that went far beyond survival or skill. He had learned about trust, patience, respect, and the quiet power of human kindness. As night fell, John stepped outside, gazing at the stars scattered across the clear prairie sky. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, understanding that life on the frontier was not only about hard work or solitude, but about the connections formed through courage, honesty, and respect. The woman and her group had come into his life unexpectedly, creating moments of learning, understanding, and quiet friendship. John realized that the bonds formed through these encounters were fragile but powerful. They reminded him that the frontier, while vast and often harsh, was also a place where trust could be built, kindness could be recognized, and understanding could bridge worlds. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his actions, though small, had created a ripple of respect and goodwill. In the quiet of the night, John Whitaker reflected on the lessons of the past days. He understood that life on the prairie would continue to bring challenges, storms, and moments of uncertainty. But he also knew that courage, honesty, and kindness were lasting treasures capable of connecting people across cultures, languages, and distance. But the encounters with the woman and her riders had shown him that the simplest actions, repairing a wagon, offering respect, and acting with integrity, could leave a lasting impact, shaping lives in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply meaningful. As he lay down to rest that night, John felt a sense of peace unlike any he had experienced before. The prairie around him was quiet, the stars overhead sparkling with clarity, and Daisy settled calmly in the corner of the cabin. The memory of the woman and the riders, their respect and their shared lessons remained vividly in his mind. He knew that their paths might cross again, and he looked forward to that possibility with hope and anticipation. For John Whitaker, the frontier had revealed something extraordinary, not just the harsh beauty of the land, but the extraordinary power of small acts of kindness, the strength of trust, and the quiet bonds that could form between people who chose to understand, respect, and honor one another. The lessons of those days would remain with him forever, a testament to the truth that even in the wild, unpredictable world of the frontier, humanity, courage, and respect could create connections that lasted a lifetime.